Hi, I'm Benton Stokes.
And I'm Elane O'Rourke.
And this is Cocktail Theology. Hello.
Hello.
How are you today?
I am good. I'm in a really good mood.
I love that you're in a really good mood.
Me too. I know you have been through this. I know our listeners have been through this. You know when you're going through kind of a rocky time?
Yep.
And your head kind of pokes above all the rocks and you see sunlight? It's like, oh, yes. Anyway, that's how I am today.
I love that.
I love that too.
And I love that I have this beautiful drink in my hand.
Yes, you do.
So this is something that you came up with.
It is.
That we enjoyed a couple of nights ago. We're having it again.
Mm-hmm. So this is called a Mayday. And
It
you
is.
named it.
I did.
So this variety of Mayday, I admit I tweaked my recipe already. So it's 2 parts rye, in this case Dickel rye, and then 1 part Aperol, and then half a part each of Meyer lemon juice and honey syrup.
Nice.
It's good.
It's
now,
really good.
So the tweak, of course, is that we used rye, and I'm going to confess something before everyone. It also has some like actual lemon juice in it. So I'm just saying. So, because I ran out of Meyer. I'm just saying. So
that's okay.
But still, tasty.
Very tasty. Yeah, when we had it before, it was with bourbon, but the rye definitely gives it a different weight or something about it's different.
Do you like it with the rye?
I like it a lot.
Okay. Then I think we keep the rye. Yeah. I think it's the spice of the rye. Just kind of gives it a little more oomph. Yeah.
I think it is too. Well, It's a beautiful drink. It's a beautiful day.
It is.
And a great time to have some conversation.
Conversation about what?
Well, today we're going to pose the question, why did Jesus ask questions?
What do you mean, why did Jesus ask questions?
So we see in the Bible a lot, in the Gospels, when Jesus is in groups of people, particularly if there are scribes or Pharisees or Sadducees or people that are really like looking very closely at what Jesus is doing and who Jesus actually might be. They will ask him questions and he'll often answer with questions.
True.
We also have other evidence of Jesus asking questions of God.
We do. Are you thinking about something in particular?
Well, certainly in the Garden of Gethsemane, we know, and on the cross, we know.
Yep.
But I am certain there were many, many times in Jesus' private prayer life where there were questions asked.
I completely agree with that. I love that you've just turned Jesus into a person, because we do ask questions of God. And if Jesus had the kind of relationship with God that we think he did, of course he'd be asking questions because it's complete trust, but it's also, what are we doing exactly? Could I get a little more info? That's what kids do.
Exactly. So I thought it would be interesting to talk about why was it that Jesus answered questions with questions, first of all. And then why did Jesus often teach lessons in the form of parables rather than just kind of coming out with it?
Well, he was trying to hide the truth, but from all but the most enlightened.
From course. All but the most enlightened.
That's right. Yeah, Jesus had kind of his own little Da Vinci Code thing going,
right.
And was hiding all of it. And but the only people who really know it are the Illuminati. Okay. So what did you grow up with? Why did people talk about that at all?
No, not really. I think in the church where I grew up, Jesus' humanity was kind of downplayed. I think there was a lot of emphasis on Jesus' divinity.
Okay.
So the assumption was that Jesus knew everything because Jesus was God. And as I have grown older and as my theology has evolved, I find Jesus much more interesting as a fully human man. And it gives me hope that I can be more like Jesus. If Jesus is just God,
it's done.
In
we're
skin,
done. Yeah, we're done.
Then there's nothing there to aspire to because we'll never be God.
Exactly.
But we can look at the relationship if we understand that Jesus is fully human and Jesus refers to God as his Father, then we can look at their relationship and we can look at the things that Jesus did to grow close, stay close in that relationship, and we can emulate that.
Yes, absolutely.
We can learn from that and we can practice the things that Jesus practiced. But in my growing up, Jesus was basically, perfect. So, so there wasn't much attention given to the questions. It was more like the parables were almost more like, how is Jesus testing us? How is Jesus?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, there's a correct answer to this,
Yes.
and I should know what it is.
Yes. Yeah, and that makes sense, because if you think about the parables in Matthew, I want to say 13. I'm not good at that. Where he starts out, but he tells a parable, and then the disciples are like, "What are you doing?" And he says, like, you can just kind of see the eye roll. And what he says is that he speaks to them directly, but to those who do not yet understand or see, he speaks in parables, which sounds to our ears, I think, that he's trying to obscure it, right? That he's saving it for his own little in-group.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're in my in-group, I'm going to tell you what's coming, instead of, if you're in my outer group, I'm just going to confound you more and more and more. Right?
Right.
I don't know if that ties into what your experience.
Oh, I think it does, yeah.
Okay. So, so many things. Well, maybe let's start with the parables. Okay. So, most people don't know what a parable is. So, a parable is not a story. It's not an allegory. Like, there's a very famous, or what used to be a very famous book called Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. And that's an allegory. Everything he does, everything he writes is standing for something else.
Right.
Okay? And it's very specific. So a lot of times we read the parables as if when I say wheat, I'm talking about some specific thing, person, whatever. Or if I say weeds, I'm talking about some specific. That's not what Jesus was doing at all. That's not the point of a parable. The point of a parable is to try and express a thought that's complicated in a way that is familiar, not so you then discern it and go, aha, but instead you go, well, what does that mean? Right? So what Jesus is doing in the parables is inviting us to engage in the conversation, to try and see things differently, right? The parable is a way of saying, hey, you've been standing in this position a long time. Why don't you go stand over there and look at the same thing? What happens when you do that?
Yeah.
Right? So that's the point of a parable. Now, once you get that, then other things, to me, become a lot clearer. So first of all, Jesus wants you to think. I know. Jesus does not want you to just swallow stuff whole. He wants you to actually chew on it, spit out the things that don't make sense, keep the things that, all of that stuff. So Jesus wants you to think, which it's pretty obvious he did.
Yeah.
So part of the answering questions with questions is to shake up that lens that you've got going. So if you said to me, hey, what do you think of my shirt? And if I answered you, that would be the end of the conversation. In fact, if I asked a question like, well, what do you think of your shirt? I would hope, you would just turn on your heel and walk out, because that's just, I hate those answers. But if I said something like, I find the way that the red and the blue and the plaid blend is really intriguing. What drew you to it? I'm engaging the conversation.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm inviting you to think differently about it. Or if I said, that same plaid, he's wearing plaid, this is not weird. That same plaid could be amazing in, God, what kind of garment would really take on that plaid? And then you would start thinking about what kind of garment would take on the plaid. Right? So the goal of Jesus in a parable, or anyone using a parable, is to get you to see differently, to think differently. Does that help with the kind of basic parable aspect of that at all?
I think so. I love what you said about Jesus wants us to think, and that parables aren't actually, there's not some hidden correct answer in a parable, but it's actually meant to create thought.
Yes.
And if you're thinking about it, then of course it's going to summon questions.
Yes, absolutely. So what would normally happen in real life, if somebody weren't writing this down, it would be something like somebody tells you a parable and everybody goes, dirt. And then somebody thinks, well, that's interesting. What about, right? That's what happens in real life when people are used to inquiry. The other key to parables, particularly for Jesus, is Jews were used to inquiry, where Christians for so many centuries have thought if you ask questions, it's a sign that you doubt, or it's a sign that you don't trust, or it's, all those things.
Right.
Jewish folks have never thought that. And particularly in the high rabbinical period, which is roughly around when Jesus was there into, I want to say, 12th century. Every day, the rabbis would discuss points in the Torah. And they would, go on and make different ideas and all of that. And eventually somebody started writing this down in the pages of the Torah, which became this thing we call the Talmud.
Yes.
Okay? So inquiry was part of their way of engaging with God's word.
Wow, yeah. And then Jesus, from a young age, had been in the temple hanging out.
All the time.
Right. With all the questions.
Yeah.
Asking his own questions.
Absolutely. So Jesus was a Jew. We really have to remember that when we read the Bible. If you don't kind of start from there, the rest is going to be just made up.
Right.
Okay. So Jesus was a Jew. He would have been used to inquiry. We saw him when he was 12, as you just mentioned, staying in the temple and arguing with people as a young man would have been expected to do. And he keeps going. So this idea that he would answer a question with question, might be considered a little cheeky, but it wouldn't have been weird.
Yeah.
Right? Where we look at it and go, just tell us. Yeah, that's not what they were doing. So the other piece of this that comes out of that is if we think that Jesus is the kind of divine human being who wants us to think, it casts a whole different look on what it means to be an apprentice to him or a friend of his.
Right.
It means that we take in things and we run them through our own person. We try to follow him, we try to emulate him, but we understand that the answers to the questions are going to be slightly different from person to person. Not huge different, but slightly.
That makes sense. I love that questions were such a part of the culture where Jesus was raised and what he came up in and what he ministered in and all of it. It was all, questions were a part of the fabric of all of their conversations. And that is not the case, has not been my experience in most Christian churches. Questions make people uncomfortable. And if you ask the pastor a question, then the pastor is going to give you an answer.
Right. Pastors are supposed to give you the correct answer.
Right. In the Christian church, we have done a terrible job of creating a space where people can feel comfortable asking questions.
Yes.
So when somebody has a question, it's considered a doubt, and it's something that you work out on your own.
I can see that.
Or you work out privately with your pastor. And
Right.
even then,
Right.
and even then there's a correct path, right? So even if you come to the pastor privately,
Right.
and you have this question or this doubt, then there is a correct path to answering the question, to settling the doubt, to restoring the faith.
Right. Well, look at that, though, what you just said, that it's all about doubt and restoring the faith.
Yep.
Wow. Yeah, I hadn't thought about it in that way, but that makes perfect sense given the history of Christianity, particularly in the United States in the last, what year is this? About 125 years, something like that. Yeah, no, that actually makes a lot of sense to me. And so in that way, your pastor becomes more like, not even Moses. There isn't really a good example in our tradition.
No, there's not.
The unassailable teacher who, if you don't get it right, will decide whether you belong in the... It's a cult leader.
Yeah.
Cult leaders are extreme. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying all pastors are cult leaders. Please don't hear me saying that. But it has that character.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Where if you doubt what that traditional kind of pastor is saying, or say, wow, that doesn't seem like what I'm getting from that, then you're kind of in trouble.
Right. And if it's not the pastor, then it's the denomination or the doctrine or whatever.
Sure.
But sometimes it's simply the pastor.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And again, this is not an attack on pastors. It's about structures, right? How organizations work, how structures work. That's actually a really interesting point. I was also thinking, just before you started talking about that, how Jesus is growing up in a Greco-Roman society. And the Greeks were all about well, what do you think about this? Well, what do you think about that? Well, I think. Now, they tended to, expound more, but because they did. But they were trying to sort things out.
Right.
Right? And they were sorting things out in public. So isn't it funny that we took a way of thinking and interacting with other people and turned it into a set of laws that even Moses would have scratched his head over?
Yeah, it's true.
Fascinating.
Well, I think Jesus understood that questions were a necessary part of faith.
Absolutely.
The necessary part of having any kind of a relationship with the divine. It means you're asking questions about, how am I to love my neighbor?
Yes.
How am I to serve?
Yes.
How am I to behave? How am I to... all of the things, and even in Jewish law, where many things were spelled out, they were still asking questions.
All the time. Half of what we see in the earlier parts of Matthew is a conversation between rabbis about what a particular passage meant. Well, even David's people took bread from the blah, 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 which is, it wasn't a, wow, you're wrong. It's a, but what about this? Here's what some of our rabbis say about this. Right? I truly believe that God wants us to be engaged with God.
I think so too.
And our idea that faith is, I wouldn't even say blind, it's this weird acceptance of a coda, is so wrong. If we can think about faith as trust is earned and articulated over time.
Yes.
Right? When we were first becoming friends, there were times where I was really watching you to see how you behaved with other people. And what does that look like? Our first kind of real butting heads at all was like, can I trust you? Can you trust me? Right. And then now I trust you with pretty much anything. I mean, there are things I wouldn't trust you with, but you know what I mean? Because human beings, right?
Yeah.
But it took the questioning, it took the engagement, it took the, rather than, Benton is wholly perfect and will never make a mistake or not pay attention to exactly what I want him to at the moment. You know what I mean? Which is just nonsense.
I think so too. And I think we're supposed to be asking questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And if listeners, if you are in a church or a fellowship or whatever where questions are discouraged, I'd take a hard look at that.
Absolutely.
Because that's, like you said, that's a little culty, honestly.
Well, it also means that you cannot grow past wherever the person who's answering the questions is.
Right. That's true. Yeah.
And Jesus said that we would do greater things than he. That would suggest that you might do different things or greater things than your pastor. But if your pastor's squelching that, there's a problem.
There's a problem. Absolutely. Listeners, we'd love to hear from you. What is your thinking on questions? Did you grow up with the idea that it's okay to ask questions? Is it okay to have doubts? Is it okay to go with God and say, I don't get it? I think in my own life in the last 15 years, I don't know where I would be if I hadn't been able to ask those kinds of questions. I think it's an important part of learning how to be like Jesus, honestly. And the fact that Jesus asked questions of God, who he related to as Father, tells us that it's okay for us to do that too.
Absolutely. And actually, if we can lift up the fact that so many churches, so many traditions practice a form of bibliolatry.
Yes.
Right? The idolatry of the Bible. God is the ultimate word. Jesus is the word on earth. The Bible is a collection of things inspired by God. But if you've got to say to the Bible, hey, that doesn't seem to fit what Jesus said, dump the Bible, pay attention to Jesus.
Pay attention to Jesus. Absolutely. We love your suggestions and your questions. We love questions, by the way. You can reach us at cocktailtheology.com anytime, and we would love to hear from you. Suggestions for episodes, for topics, for questions, and
for cocktails.
For sure. We appreciate you guys listening. We hope that you will subscribe, follow, favorite us wherever you are listening right now. We are in all the places, and so it's easy to find us. And please do share us in your social media and among your friends.
Please.
That's how we grow this audience, is with you guys. So we appreciate you listening. We hope you'll tune in next week. We have new episodes out every Thursday.
Yay.
Bye.
Bye.